welcome you watching Insight on NewsX. I'm Neha Khanna. Our big focus tonight, it's a story that's been grabbing headlines for weeks now, but there's no end in sight to growing Chinese aggression. The border standoff with India apart, the sharp rhetoric emerging from Beijing has given way to sabre-rattling and now bordering on war-mongering. In the latest provocation, Chinese state media has warned that China is battle-ready and that India will face an all-out confrontation along the entire disputed border of nearly 3,500 kilometers. The news report says China doesn't fear going to war to safeguard its sovereignty and will make itself ready for a long-term confrontation. On Monday, their state-run television showed the Chinese army conducting live-fire drills in Tibet. Last week, China told foreign diplomats that its patience with India won't be indefinite. Today, China claimed that foreign diplomats in Beijing are shocked by what they call India's illegal trespass into Chinese territory across the Sikkim border. Sources say India too has been briefing foreign embassies and maintains that tensions will be defused diplomatically. Sources also suggest that the confrontation in Sikkim is causing concern in capitals around the world. So far, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval has not changed his plans to travel to China later this month for a BRICS meeting, and he is expected to raise the Sikkim standoff during this trip. But the question is, why is China flexing its muscle and upping the ante on all fronts? Why this warmongering and why now? Does this have to do with China's hegemonic and expansionist designs? Is this an attempt by China to establish its complete dominance in the region? Could this be driven in some measure by domestic politics in that country? Is Beijing testing Prime Minister Modi and his resolve? Is this just psychological warfare, or could China escalate this even further? What are India's options? And in the eventuality of a military conflict, would India be ready?
The dragon is playing tricks. Threatening and provoking India is China's attempt to cover up its internal turmoil.
At a time when China is facing a serious internal conflict, questions are being raised as to whether the tension that they're building up with India is a means to deflect attention from their own internal turmoil. Tension that they're building up with India is a means to deflect attention from their own internal turmoil. India's Ministry of External Affairs has been extremely restrained in their responses to China's provocations.
As he faces challenges in his own home, China's attempts to build pressure on India on the border are mere diversionary tactics.
印度边防部队人员非法越界，这个事件引起了国际社会的广泛关注。不少国家的驻华外交官对此感到震惊和难以理解。他们通过外交渠道向中方求证。我想强调的是呢，这次事件的事实是非常清楚的。
China is under criticism over dissident and Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo's death. Also, Jinping is expected to start his second term as the party boss, with behind-the-scenes political struggles gearing up. As he attempts to deflect attention from its internal tussle, it's time India calls Xi's bluff. Bureau Report, NewsX.
And so the big questions we're asking tonight: has China's aggression now given way to sabre-rattling and warmongering? Threat after threat, why is China flexing its muscle and why now? China, the aggressor, accusing India of aggression. What is the dragon's game plan? Is this just psychological warfare, or is the dragon determined to engage in conflict? Is this China's attempt to establish its regional dominance, or are its moves driven by domestic politics? Amidst growing Chinese aggression and daily threats, just what are India's options? And can New Delhi tame the dragon, and how should it go about it? Let's take that straight across to the experts. Joining me on the debate tonight is Shilkan Sharma, former diplomat. He's here with me in the studio. Also with me in the studio, Professor Swaran Singh, professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Joining us live from Beijing via Skype is Einar Tangen, a political commentator. And we're also hoping to be joined later on the show by Lieutenant General Shankar Prasad, defense expert, and Professor M.D. Nalapat, editorial director of the Sunday Guardian. Mr. Shilkan Sharma, if I could begin with you. Let's address these questions that we've raised one by one. Over the last several weeks and months, we've seen this steady escalation of tension along the border. What's particularly a concern right now is the, sabre-rattling that's going on, the extremely sharp rhetoric that's emerging from Beijing. Now you have Beijing accusing India of being the aggressor in this situation. They've been briefing foreign embassies and talking about how their patience with India is not indefinite. The question simply is, sir, what do you think is going on here? What is the Chinese game plan in your assessment?
In my view, China has been sending a very simplistic message: give up or escalate. And India has been politely declining it, both the options. Now that is roiling China. They don't like it. So first they go on a media offensive, and the Chinese state-controlled media goes in multiple tongues and starts, spewing venom and fire at India. India does not, Indian government is still very restrained.
They've actually been remarkably restrained.
Yes.
And one has been, the questions have been asked about what should be read into India's restraint, because on the one hand, India is refusing to budge as far as its deployment of troops along the border is concerned, but yet verbally there's been a lot of restraint. How would you read that?
Well, it is also the point you mentioned is in contrast with previous face-offs where our media would go to town and the Chinese would underplay.
Okay.
Even actually, I'm not a China man. In the foreign office, I'm not in the China stream. But whatever out of China, interest, whatever I have read, there's been a story some time back that even 62 war, Chinese don't much worry about. It is in India that they say India is overly sensitive about it.
No, but
Suddenly
fact of the matter is, just recently they reminded our defense minister, they felt the need to actually remind us of, quote unquote, the historical lessons that the 1960 war should have taught India. Of course, and you had the defense minister replying to that saying India of today is not India of 1962.
But I must tell you that this is China, this is vintage China. A few years back when Abe was coming in Japan,
yes,
and he was thinking of revising his defense, policy. And the Hiroshima anniversary came. These Global Times, which is, doing a lot of dancing song, came out with a photograph of Hiroshima destruction. And below the photograph, the quip was, and Japan wants to militarize again.
Good Lord.
So, this is how China talks.
Okay.
So we'll teach you a lesson.
Yes.
And that kind of stuff. And India has been remarkably restrained in not taking the bait.
But, Professor Singh, if I could come to you at this point. Yes, India has been restrained. Yes, India maintains that this is going to be defused diplomatically. But fact of the matter is that the signs that are emanating from Beijing have been described as worrying. Some have gone to the extent of describing it as alarming. The question is it really up to India to defuse the situation? Because right now, the dragon is certainly spewing fire. The question firstly is, why now? Why this flexing of muscle by China, and why display of so much aggression at this point? Do you believe this is essentially just psychological warfare and it will remain confined to that? Or has it now come to a point where India needs to prepare itself for any eventuality? We don't certainly intend to indulge in any war-mongering, but like I said, the rhetoric, the shrill rhetoric emerging from Beijing is a source of concern. That's why I'm asking you this question.
I think all of us are noticing that India is showing enormous restraint and Chinese are ratcheting up the rhetoric. Why it is so? The ground reality is that Indian troops have pushed back the Chinese troops. So the so-called rising powerful China is on the back foot. So on the ground it seems the status quo since June 16 is in favor of India because we pushed them back. So after pushing them back, we are playing very calm. We are saying we want to really have dialogue and negotiate on the table and solve it. And Chinese have to ratchet up because they are on the back foot. They seem to be pushed back, and that's something that rattles the Chinese leaders who really think that India is no comparison to China's both economic and military progress.
But some have also said that, China has actually been taken aback by India's firm resolve. Because even though India is not engaged in the kind of verbal jousting that Beijing may be indulging in, yet as far as the deployment of our troops along the border is concerned, India has displayed a firm resolve which may have taken China by surprise. Is that an assessment you agree
No,
with?
if the assessment is that Chinese are taken by surprise, then perhaps we are walking through a slippery path. But I don't believe that. I think Chinese had looked at various possibilities as an outcome of such an advance. And that shows the kind of calibrated response that you notice from China across media, academics, officials from Ministry of Defense and Foreign Affairs. It seems fairly calibrated, and I want to make a point here. To me, it seems we have crossed the peak and we are now tapering down the rhetoric from the Chinese side. You remember the initial talk about...
But sir, I'm sorry if I could intervene there. You were saying that the rhetoric may be tapering off, but I'm afraid, again, the signals emanating from Beijing don't seem to suggest that, because just today they have accused India of being the aggressor. Just yesterday, their state media said, our patience with New Delhi is not indefinite.
I understand. I was going to say that, they are not going to give up very quickly, because you did mention initially the domestic compulsions of President Xi Jinping. This Saturday, they have dismissed the Chongqing Party Secretary, Sun, and he is, the party secretary of same municipality where Po Xilai was not only dismissed, he was disgraced, he is now in jail. He was
Professor, if I could just request you, before I go across to General Shankar Prasad and our guest in China, if you could explain for the benefit of our viewers, very quickly, what is, this entire dynamic of the internal politics that's playing out currently in Beijing, and in your assessment, do you think that has a huge bearing on what we're witnessing right now?
In very simple terms, China is ruled by one party. We all know they have a monopoly on power, but internally, every 5 years, there is an enormous change in leadership that happens. Up to 65% people kind of move to either next position or go home. And that has increasingly become fairly vicious, because it has become transparent. The whole world debates about transition of party leadership. And this is supposed to happen in this October or November, when National People's Congress meets, when President Xi Jinping will present his work report, what has he achieved, and ask for the next 5 years. He is expected to also give the layout of the next generation of leaders. And that's where the kind of internal bloodbath begins. And therefore, that leaves him very little space to be appearing to be not strong and nationalist, and begin to make compromises with a neighboring not strong and nationalist, and begin to make compromises with a neighboring country called India, and especially in the name of small country called Bhutan.
Correct.
PLA is celebrating 90th anniversary, so for them also it's not the time to make accommodation and a compromise on any situation. So they have domestic compulsions not to really cool down very quickly.
That's really interesting, and also there is now a lot of speculation and talk in the media about how Xi Jinping could actually, consider breaking from the norm of, seeking a 10-year term, and perhaps aiming even for a third term this time round. We will put that question to our guest in Beijing in just a moment. Before that, let me bring in General Shankar Prasad at this point. So you heard what our other panelists have had to say. My question to you is simply this. Why the sabre-rattling by China suddenly? Why now? So do you see it as essentially an extension of China's hegemonic designs? Do you think this is driven largely by domestic politics? Or do you think what Beijing is essentially trying to do is test Prime Minister Modi? General Prasad, can you hear me? Okay, we may have lost the line there to General Prasad. We'll try and go across to him in just a moment with those questions. But at this point, let me bring in our guest from Beijing. Einar Tangen joins us via Skype. Mr. Tangen, thanks very much for speaking to us. Now, here in India, the talk really is that China is the aggressor and is accusing India of aggression, in the process bullying a tiny country like Bhutan. There is now growing speculation that apart from China's expansionist and hegemonic designs, which may be behind this, it's also its domestic politics which may be driving, its moves on the India-China front, and also the growing shrill rhetoric and war-mongering that we are witnessing almost every single day. Mr. Tangen, what's your response to that?
Well, my response is that the question seems a bit loaded. You seem to have prejudged even before I say anything.
No,
the Chinese
Mr. Tangan,
perspective,
I am putting to you, sir, what is being talked about here. My question simply is, this is what many in India believe. How would you respond to that?
Yes. Well, on June 8th, Indian troops crossed the border that had been established with China to help, quote, Bhutan. Those troops are still there. China is insisting that this is not appropriate, just as if Chinese troops had crossed into India, quote, in aid of some other country. Now, as far as diplomatic goes, there was no actual protest launched by Bhutan until the 29th. There were a lot of times in between. China was expecting India troops to withdraw and to ask for some sort of negotiation. That has not happened. Instead, the rhetoric on both sides has continued to escalate. But I can assure you, from the Chinese point of view, they see this not as an internal issue or a cover-up. You know, the news waves are completely loaded with everything about Donald Trump, not about Xi Jinping. As far as the party secretary of Chongqing, he was apparently brought in under questioning for some sort of wrongdoing within the party, which is not nefarious, it just happens. So the crackdown on these tigers has been going on, unlike other countries where tigers sometimes go free or impugn the law or run away. China has had a concerted effort to do this. And as far as this situation goes, the only way I can see it diffusing is if India were to withdraw its troops with the condition that there be talks immediately.
Mr.
Maybe the
Tangan,
same day, if someone goes, to settle this. Otherwise, what? People are going to stand there and look at each other day after day until something happens?
Mr. Tangan, if I could just come in here for a moment. Also, our Indian guest, Professor Singh, wants to come in here. You know, you accuse us of intruding into your territory. Fact of the matter is, India maintains that it's China that's intruded into Bhutanese territory. Bhutan is a friendly country, and India has chosen to come to Bhutan's rescue because it is a long-standing friend. And let's not forget that Bhutan, sir, it's not just India. Bhutan has raised objections to what they call Chinese incursion into their territory. You would recall it is Bhutan that issued a démarche, sir, to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And also, you know, you talked, Mr. Tangan, about the shrill rhetoric on both sides. I beg to differ, sir, because fact of the matter is that India has maintained utmost restraint. It is China that is indulging every single day in sabre-rattling and war-mongering every day. Mr. Tangan, if you could just hear me out for a moment, it is China that's every day issuing threats, either through its state media or through its foreign ministry. Before I go across to my other guest, Professor Singh wants to make a quick intervention.
My friend Anna Tangan is saying that it's just a casual investigation against a party secretary. Chen Sai is not an ordinary party secretary of Chongqing province. He's seen as a protege of former Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, was contending for the top position in the next leadership, which is to be announced by Xi, as he claims his second term. So it's not an ordinary investigation that has happened out of blue, suddenly, without any reports of this kind. So there is a kind of an internal crisis which he's facing. All I'm saying is Xi Jinping has limited maneuverability. Therefore, it will be really, very, very painful, slow movement. And I'm estimating somewhere towards late autumn that we'll resolve this issue, not before that.
All right, we'll dwell on that, you know, the internal politics in just a moment. But General Prasad, if I could come to you now, we'd lost the line to you earlier, sir. I'm glad, you know, we can now finally come to you. So my question is simply this, and I was asking you this even earlier. Why do you think China is flexing its muscle the way it is, and why now? Is it essentially part of its hegemonic designs? Is China trying to send out a message to Prime Minister Modi and testing him in the process? Or is this, do you think, in a large measure driven by domestic politics? How do you view it, sir? All right, we seem to be having tough luck with General Prasad's line tonight. Mr. Sharma, let me come back to you at this point. You heard what our guest from Beijing had to say, and this is really the problem. You know, they continue to accuse India of intruding into their territory, when fact of the matter is that it is Bhutan that has, lodged an official complaint and said that Chinese troops have entered their territory and begun road construction, which India has just made an intervention and stopped, because at the end of the day, Bhutan is a friend, and also because it does affect India's strategic interests. But point is that China is refusing to back down, despite the fact that India has, been restrained as much as it possibly could. The question is, sir, what is the way out? National Security Advisor Ajit Doval is slated to visit Beijing later this month for the BRICS summit, and many believe he is going to take up this issue. Where do you see this going from here, sir?
As I said before, India has not been taking the bait to escalate. But since the Chinese have decided to call the diplomats and brief them, it's logical for India to also brief the diplomats about the position that India has.
Yes.
And I want to say emphatically that this kind of equivalence between India and China position is not factually correct.
Exactly.
Because India has not been building the roads, and road doesn't build, doesn't come. It's not like cooking rice.
Correct.
Road takes
it
time
doesn't come up overnight.
It has been coming out.
Exactly.
Then Bhutan, which says that is their territory. And that point, whether that territory belongs to Bhutan or China,
yes,
is a matter of dispute which has to be solved in this trilateral commission, trilateral meeting.
Exactly.
Also, the treaty which they are quoting, Bhutan was not part of the treaty.
Correct.
So now Bhutan is a tiny country.
And fact is, it is Bhutan that has lodged an official complaint.
They have
and whether anyone likes it or not, Beijing is currently being seen as bullying a tiny country like Bhutan. All right, since we were having great difficulty with our communication lines earlier on the show, I'm told we can finally go across to Lieutenant General Shankar Prasad and Professor Nalapad. Before I completely run out of time, let me get a quick word in from our two guests. General Prasad, I hope you can finally hear me. So my question to you is, why do you think there's so much saber-rattling happening on Beijing's part right now? Is this just sheer hegemony on part of China? Is China trying to test Prime Minister Modi? Or is this perhaps driven to a large extent by their domestic politics? So how do you view this muscle flexing that China is doing right now?
All of the points that you made are correct, and I completely endorse them. All of those points are valid today. The primary issue today we have to look at is the current situation. Why China has done it? Because of its intentions of getting more.
Gosh. It's really Murphy's Law to work today as far as our line 2, General Prasad, is concerned. Professor Nalapad, before we lose the line to you as well, let me quickly bring you into the conversation. So what do you think is going on? Is this just psychological warfare, or do you think the dragon is determined to escalate this to the level of a conflict? What do you think, sir, are India's options? We know Ajit Doval is traveling to Beijing later this month, and this issue is likely to come up. India is determined to defuse this diplomatically, but I'm not sure if the Chinese are listening.
Well, Neha, the fact is that in the past, all the time, whether it was Prime Minister Vajpayee or Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, whenever Beijing made a huge fuss over something, they would usually relent. So clearly Beijing thought that the same tactic could be used now, and if they make a huge fuss, the government would relent. We have seen in the case of Dalai Lama visiting Arunachal, they made a huge fuss, the government did not relent, Dalai Lama went to Arunachal. We have seen the case of OBOR, that conference in Beijing.
Yes.
Government was against going to the conference, Americans were against, Japanese were against. Then of course, both Mr. Trump and Mr. Abe ate humble pie and bowed to Beijing, and they sent people there, but India did not. I think they have to understand that in Modi there's a different kind of Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
And what they have done in the past will not work in the future. So I think it's very important from their point of view that they behave towards India in such a way that promotes a good relationship, and this basically means behaving in a mutually respectful manner.
Right. All right. On that note, we will have to wrap up this debate. My apologies to our guests because we had terribly bad luck today with our communication lines. But thanks to our entire panel for joining us on this debate. Where does this go from here? Can New Delhi tame the dragon? Is this a test for Prime Minister Modi and his resolve? Many would agree. But is this just a psychological warfare, or is China determined to escalate this further? We'll probably find the answer to those questions in the coming weeks. On that note, thanks very much for watching.